This figure is an artist's depiction looking back on the famine, or so-called famine, in Ukraine. Inside the bright green line are the provinces with the highest death toll. These are also the areas of Ukraine with the highest grain output. The Ukrainians were the largest non-Russian group within the Soviet Union at the times. Early on, before Stalin, they were allowed some freedom politically and economically, and freedom to pursue their own cultural identity. Stalin wanted to replace the small farms belonging to families in Ukraine with collectivized farms where these workers would work for the state in huge collectives. The people who were identified as enemies were talked about as though they were rich people, rich peasants called kulaks. But in fact, all of the Ukrainian people suffered under this genocide, and all were targeted simply because they didn't join the collective farms. It seems that the freedom in the 20s encouraged the Ukrainians to hope for much more than Stalin could give them. And in effect, this genocide, though it would never be written down this way, was all about getting rid of Ukrainians so that they wouldn't be a thorn in Stalin's side anymore. These statistics show that even though there might have been a shortage of grain to some degree in 32 and 34, that during the genocide there was no famine in the sense of a natural disaster which caused people to starve. So that in the worst year on record, Stalin was able to feed the rest of the Soviet Union, but of course not Ukraine. Ironically, those who died were those who lived in the areas that actually produced the most grain, even during the lean years. The law implemented in 1932 in effect said that Ukrainians were not allowed to feed themselves. Another law separated the villages that grew the grain from the rest of Russia, so that the Ukrainian people were finally marked for starvation. Russian peoples were encouraged to settle in the lands that formerly belonged to the Ukrainians. Quotas for those who lived in Ukraine were raised to such a degree in 1932 that there was no grain left for the farmers to eat. So to use the word famine is imprecise. Basically, what Stalin did was to starve the Ukrainians. It's rather obvious to the historian that what was going on inside Ukraine was something that was orchestrated by Stalin. Ukrainians weren't allowed to pass from the zones where the starvation was taking place into other territories of Russia. While the so-called famine was going on, the Soviet Union was selling grain to the Western markets. The The fatality rate inside Ukraine was staggering. Children were especially at risk because they couldn't bear the consequences of hunger the same way that adults did. Those capable of leading the Ukrainians were special targets. We'll never know the precise number of victims, though we know the suffering was great. There were villages that lost 100% of their population, and some simply a fraction. The loss of livestock during the period of the famine shows the extremity. We should note that not all areas of Ukraine suffered equally. The media was very carefully controlled by the Soviet Union. The journalists knew what to expect of Stalin and may have even feared for their own lives if they opposed him. One major exception to the rule was Walter Duranty of the New York Times. He was allowed to report because he reported what the Russian authorities wanted him to report. The propaganda that Duranty helped spread actually indicated the very opposite of the truth. Duranty is recorded as having confessed to the falsehood of his reporting. Walter Duranty received the Pulitzer Prize for these falsehoods. It may seem a minor thing, but the revoking of the Pulitzer Prize would go a long way toward making the Ukrainians understand that their suffering was recognized by the greater world. There were a few reporters who defied Stalin and even published photographs of the victims of the famine. Several important countries understood what was going on in Ukraine. Further aid was given to Stalin by countries who would not allow aid to pass from their country to Ukraine. This ad was posted by the Society of Friends, also known as Quakers. From our perspective in history, it's clear what was going on. Ukrainian President Viktor Yushchenko released some of the KGB records on the famine, and it became clear to all, couldn't be denied, that it was not really a famine, but starvation. In the Ukrainian language, this genocide is known as the Holodomor, which means in Ukrainian death by starvation. More recently, President Viktor Yanukovych, also president of Ukraine, indicated that the Holodomor really was a tragedy for all people of the Soviet Union and not only the Ukrainians. This memorial was constructed in Kiev, the capital and largest city of Ukraine. Another view of the memorial. A link to this resource is provided in your lecture materials for this module. A website titled Famine-Genocide in Ukraine 1932 to 1933 is available to provide additional information. Students are also encouraged to view survivor testimonies provided through YouTube.